Hey, learning enthusiasts. Welcome to our little mini lecture on rhetoric. What is rhetoric? Well, first of all, let's all say the word out loud. Rhetoric. Go on, say it. Say it out loud. Rhetoric. 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 Okay, it's not pronounced rhetoric. Okay, so it's not rhetoric. It's rhetoric. All right, awesome. See, we're learning already. So what is rhetoric? Let's go ahead and jump into this. When we hear the word rhetoric used in conversation, it often has a negative connotation or a negative sense to it. This is especially true when used in the context of politics. So a lot of times we'll hear, if we're critiquing a politician's speech, we might say, oh, their rhetoric was divisive, or their rhetoric was angry, or dismissive, or whatever the case is. We often use it in a negative sense. However, rhetoric is a very nuanced and dynamic concept with many applications. So it's not a negative thing. There are negative aspects of it, or depending on how it's used, it can be a negative thing. But rhetoric in and of itself is not either negative or positive. It's just, it is, right? So let's go ahead and dig a little bit deeper into this. Let's refer to the definition of rhetoric provided on San Diego State University's Rhetoric and Writing Studies Department's webpage. That's a mouthful there. So they define rhetoric in this way. Rhetoric refers to the study and uses of written, spoken, and visual language. It investigates how language is used to organize and maintain social groups, construct meanings and identities, coordinate behavior, mediate power, produce change, and create knowledge. Rhetoricians, or the people who study rhetoric, often assume that language is constitutive, meaning we shape and are shaped by language. In other words, how we use language can determine who we are as people. It can shape our identities. They assume that language is dialogic, meaning it exists in the shared territory between self and other, or in other words, it means that it exists in the public space where we share it with other people, right? They assume that language is closely connected to thought, mental activity as inner speech. So our thoughts inside our minds, of course, is very much connected to rhetoric, and integrated with social, cultural, and economic practices, meaning language dictates how we act socially, culturally, and economically. They all have it has implications for all of these different aspects of life. Rhetorical study and written literacy are understood to be essential to civic, professional, and academic life. So, indeed, I want to reiterate that rhetoric is essential and it's all around us. We can't escape it. It's kind of like, for those of you who are familiar with the Matrix, it's like the Matrix, right? So when we start to understand rhetoric, we can see how it works in our daily lives and how rhetoric shapes really everything. I'm going to make that argument that rhetoric is everything. Everything is rhetorical in some way or other. When understanding rhetoric in this way, we can begin to see what Lunsford and Ruskevich, the authors of our textbook, mean when they claim everything's an argument. So they make this very provocative claim right in the title of the book that everything we encounter, regardless of what it is some kind of argument. And by the word argument, they don't mean some kind of conflict, they mean an opinion of some kind, a message of some kind. So when we examine something, we can try to determine what its message is, the message that it's sending out into the world. So some key definitions here. These are some basic definitions, but they're very key. So if you're not already doing so, it's a good idea to take some notes on this. And in fact, anytime that you watch any videos for our class, or if I post any documents such as this in the modules, you always want to take notes in your notebook. So the first definition is of rhetoric. So let's get just a basic definition. Rhetoric: the means or methods by which an argument or message is conveyed. How a message is conveyed. So in other words, how something is pushed across, how a meaning is conveyed to the world. Now, the other basic definition is of the word text. Now, we use this word usually to mean printed words, right? So words on a screen, this would be considered text. That's where the term text message comes from, right? Because it's a written out message that you receive on your phone. That's what it means there. But text has a much broader definition. So text really is anything that can be analyzed, anything with a meaning or message. And so I said earlier, when we're talking about the title of our textbook, Lunsford and Ruskovich's claim that everything is an argument, that means that everything, if there is an argument to be made, it means that it is a text. So anything that we can study to determine a meaning or a message or argument can be considered a text. So whether that's a written document such as this, or an essay or a book, that's kind of a traditional understanding of a text. A movie can be considered a text because we can analyze and study movies to determine different meanings or messages in them. A song is considered a text because songs have meanings and messages. But we can also get a little bit more abstract. So as we'll talk about further a little bit later, our clothing can be considered a text. A water bottle can be considered a text. So if somebody has a reusable water bottle, the message that that text might send to the world, if we analyze it, is that maybe that person cares about plastic pollution, or maybe it's a special kind of water bottle that keeps the water very cold, so they care about cold water. That's a message. It might seem a little basic, but when you analyze anything, or when you pay close attention to anything, you can begin to determine that it has a message of some kind. Some things are harder to determine, but everything has a message of some kind. So physical space is something that can be read rhetorically. So physical spaces, such as classrooms, can be analyzed rhetorically, meaning we can try to determine what the message is within that given physical space. The way a building is constructed sends a message. Courthouses and government buildings, for example, are often designed in a classical style in order to send messages of authority, respect, and seriousness. So, for example, a lot of the buildings in Washington, D.C. have this kind of really classical, kind of Roman architecture with the big columns, right? So that sends a message of authority, of respect, of seriousness, right? When you just look at the building. The way classrooms are arranged also send messages. So here we have an image of a traditional classroom setting where we have rows of desks arranged neatly. They're all facing toward the front of the room, where we have a chalkboard, a projector screen, kind of a podium desk scenario. So that is a traditional classroom arrangement. What message does this classroom arrangement send? The desks arranged in neat rows facing the chalkboard and projector screen signal to anyone who enters the classroom that their attention should be directed toward the front of the room. So that's immediate. When you walk into a room and see this, we can kind of get that message just based on the way the furniture is arranged. It dictates that message for us. The language, so I'm using it kind of a metaphorical sense here, the language of the room, the way it is set up, in other words, conveys that message. Because we are able to analyze this room to determine a message, we can call this room a text because it is an object of study. So remember, anything that we can analyze to determine a message is considered a text. So this photo is a text right here. But if this were the actual room, if we were physically in the room, then we would be analyzing the room itself. So in that case, the room itself is the text. So let's look at another text here. So in this image, we have a classroom, but instead of having the neat rows of desks facing forward, we have a circle of chairs, and they're all facing one another. So when we walk into this room, the message is conveyed pretty immediately that we're supposed to be sitting in these chairs facing one another. The message that's conveyed by the way this room is set up is that each person sitting in a chair demands the same amount of attention as anyone else sitting in the circle of chairs. The rhetorical choices in the furniture arrangement help to convey this message. So, again, the way that this classroom is arranged sends the message that whoever's at the front of the room is the person that deserves the attention and respect, right? Whereas here, this message being sent is that everybody deserves the same amount of attention, right? Because everybody's facing one another. So we can see how physical spaces then are arranged rhetorically, right, to send certain messages. And the same is true of our houses, the way we've arranged our furniture. If you look into most living rooms, the furniture is all arranged facing what? The television, right? So a living room, it's sending the message that when you're in that room, the thing that deserves attention is the TV. So if you start to look around physical spaces, you can kind of see how those choices, the way furniture is arranged, is sending messages, whether they're consciously arranged in that way or not. So sometimes it's a message that's not intended to be sent, but it's still sent just the same, even if the person making the furniture arrangements didn't intend that message to be sent. Rhetorical choices in style of dress. So I mentioned earlier that our clothing choices can be read and understood rhetorically. The way we dress ourselves can be read rhetorically. Think about the message you send to the world, either consciously or unconsciously, by your clothing choices. The brands we wear, the colors we choose, the style of clothing we adopt, these all send a message about ourselves to the world. So, for example, if you wear shirts with logos on them, you're sending some kind of message. So, whether that's a sports team or a band that you like or whatever the case is, we make those choices to send that message to the world. So, if I'm wearing a shirt that has a band logo on it that I like, I'm sending the message to the world that I should be, included with members of fans of that band, for example. And a lot of times those things are connected to other deeper things. So a lot of times our musical choices or tastes are connected to deeper values that we hold, right? So I'm a big fan of punk rock, and so the that's connected to deeper things that constitute my identity, right? And so I'm trying to convey that to the world consciously or unconsciously by my clothing choices. Just as if I'm in a classroom teaching, I'm going to dress in such a way that's going to send the message that I'm a teacher, for example. We also make choices based on context, so I was kind of hinting at this. If we want to send the message that we should be taken seriously at a job interview or important meeting, for instance, then we dress in such a way that would convey that message. Showing up to a job interview in sweatpants will likely send the message that we don't take the job opportunity or the people conducting the interview seriously. However, if we are simply hanging out with our best friend, sweatpants might be an appropriate choice for that context, right? Because I don't need to worry about sending the message that I should be taken seriously if I'm just with my best friend, right? The message doesn't need to be the same, and so my clothing choices are dictated by that. Rhetoric in language. So, of course, language is our principal text object of study here. So, the way we write and speak is also very much rhetorical. How we convey a message depends on what it is and for whom it is intended. For example, the way we speak to our grandmother is going to be different from the way we speak to our best friend. How we get the message across is rhetoric, right? So even if you're trying to convey the same piece of information to your grandmother versus your best friend, the way you do that is going to be different because your audience is different, right? And so that's where context comes into play. And we call this a rhetorical situation. So we'll learn about that when we begin reading from Everything's an Argument. So after reading chapter 1, understanding arguments and reading them critically, think about the textbook's title. When Lunsford and Ruskovich claim that everything's an argument, what do they mean?